Praise be to God's holy name. Today's scripture portion for our meditation is 1 Timothy chapter 5. In this chapter, Paul advises Timothy how to treat people in the church. Verse 1 and 2. These two verses lay down the spirit which the different age relationships should display. First, to older people, we must show affection and respect. Two, to our contemporaries, we must show brotherliness. And three, to those of the opposite sex, our relationship must always be marked with purity. Paul directed Timothy not to rebuke an older man. A young partner like Timothy should shepherd him faithfully with due respect for the years and presumed wisdom of the older man. He should be encouraged like a father, and younger men should be treated as brothers. Older women should be treated as mothers, and younger ones as sisters with all purity. Verse 3 to verse 6. How to treat widows and those in need. The Christian church inherited a fine tradition of charity to those in need. The passage goes on to lay down certain of the qualities of the people whom the church is called upon to support. The widows should be honored, that is, they need to be supported and sustained. Financial support should be given in a dignified and honorable way. The passage tells that real widow is one who is left alone and has no one else to support her. Those with children should be taken care at home by the children themselves. Those who are legitimately helped by the church should serve the church in some way. They could continue in supplications and prayers night and day. They should also lead godly lives. The life lived for mere pleasure and ease is no life at all. It is a living death, whether lived by a young widow or anyone else. Verse 7 and 8. Where should provision come from? A good pastor will teach these things and so will know what God expects of them. Paul emphasized the responsibility of a man to provide for his family and do all he could to support them. According to God's divine plan, the elderly should be taken care of by the children. Verse 9 and 10. It is about helping the older widows. From this passage, it is clear that the church had an official register of widows, and it seems that the widow is being used in a double sense. First, were the aged women whose husbands had died, and another group of women who may be able to perform other loving duties in the church. The widows under 60 would support themselves or get remarried. The widows who were accepted into the support of the church must not only be true widows, but they must also have godly character. When Paul says they should have brought up children, he probably meant both the raising of her own children and the receiving of abandoned infants. The widows must be women who had been prepared to give a home to abandoned children. The church needs people who are prepared to do the tasks which receive no prominence and little thanks. The Christian widows must be willing to accept the humble tasks in the service of Christ and his people. They must have helped people in trouble. In days of persecution, it was no small thing to help Christians who were suffering for their faith. When we study these qualifications for those who were to be enrolled as widows, we see that they are the qualifications of every true Christian. Verse 11 to verse 16. These verses speak about the perils of idleness and how to help the young widows. As general rule, the young widows were not supported by the church because they could provide for themselves and could remarry. Paul did not condemn young widows for wanting to get married, but was against them who do not conduct themselves in a godly way in regard to relationships. He is against the idle women who wander from house to house in an empty social round. They may become gossipers and talk scandals. Such a woman ran the risk of becoming a busybody because she had nothing of her own to take up her attention. She would be over interested in the affairs of the others. So, the advice is that these young women should marry and engage upon the greatest task of all, that is, rearing a family and making a home. Paul concluded by saying that the family members should support the widows. The true destitute women could be supported by the church. Verse 17 to verse 18. How should the elders be treated in the church? The elders in the church are those who rule and those who teach. If an elder does rule well and does labor in the world and doctrine, that one is worthy of double honor. In verse 3, Paul says that widows were worthy of honor, which means the financial support, and the elder is worthy of double honor. Elders ought to be properly honored and properly paid. The scripture says that those who serve God's people should be paid, and Paul quotes Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4, and Luke chapter 10, verse 7. Verse 19 and 20. How should the sinning brother be treated? Those who persist in sin are to be publicly rebuked. Paul cautions that any accusation against a leader should be carefully verified by two or three witnesses. However, if leaders are in sin, it must be addressed forthright with public rebuke to promote a fear of sin among the leadership and the entire church. From verse 21 to verse 25, Paul gives instructions to Timothy. Verse 21. Prejudice and partiality are grave sins before God, and Timothy should administer his office without favoritism. Verse 22. He should be careful about approving the ministry of another person. He should not be in a hurry to lay hands on anyone or ordinate anyone, but should wait for the right time. If Timothy was called to observe and assess the lives of others, it was important for him to keep himself pure. Verse 23. Paul finds time to slip in a loving advice to Timothy about his health. His medical advice to Timothy was to use a little wine to overcome his frequent infirmities. Paul is simply saying that there is no virtue in an act which harms the body. Verse 24 and 25. Now, finally, it is about Paul's advice in the difficulty in looking at a man's sin and his good works. The sins of some people are clearly evident, whereas some others are hidden. Good works, on the other hand, cannot be hidden. They are always eventually revealed. This saying bids us leave things to God and be content. God knows the good deeds and their intentions, and He will repay for the good deeds. So, as we recall this chapter, Paul has specifically instructed Timothy how the elderly, the young should be treated in the church. Care is taken by Paul to include even the insignificant ones who will be usually forgotten. As people who follow God's instructions, we should also be concerned about the poor, the destitute, and the sinners. Opportunity for salvation needs to be provided in the church for them to be made whole. May the Lord help us also to follow these instructions in our own churches. Amen.